For sure, we wouldn't be who we are without our students. So thank you very much. And we put a lot of effort in getting the right mix of people to become the Glocal students, and we're really happy when we see you come together, join, and become such an amazing group. Thanks very much. It is a great honor for me to ask Professor John Barry from Queen's University of Belfast to come and give his keynote lecture, just so I don't mess up the title. Transition to Sustainability in the 21st Century, Why is the Future Bright? So Professor Barry has worked extensively in the field of sustainability, political economy of environment, and the relationship between the different factors. Professor Barry arrived to us earlier this week and gave an amazing course on environment and development, which is a field that Glocal aspires to grow into furthermore, and we really invite Professor Barry to come again as much as possible. I wanted to give a very small token of appreciation to Professor Barry for coming. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we are really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Great,
this is some water for you here.
That's great. Thank you. Shalom. Céad Míle Fáilte. That's Irish for 100,000 thank yous. We like to exaggerate because we're Irish. How can I follow that last talk? Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, before I begin, I'd like to say a couple of things. Can I say it's wonderful to think that in Israel, just like in Ireland, nothing good ever starts on time. Everything always goes over. I'd like to also say just a brief comment to Picky Glocal cohort graduating today. It's been my pleasure to have taught you since Sunday. You have been an extremely lively, challenging, thoughtful group of students to teach, and I'm really looking forward to seeing your assignments. I'll just give you two Irish blessings, and as many of you know, I'm not somebody of faith, but I do think there's a lot of value in religious ideas. And the English translation is this. This is particularly for the graduates today. May the rose rise with you. May the sun be always at your back. And may your God hold you in the palm of his hands. And may you be in heaven half an hour before the devil knows you're dead. The second blessing in English is more particular in terms of your interest in development. It is that we live in each other's shadow. We are each other's shelter. We are each other's keepers in terms of development, peace, and security. The last thing I'd like to say is I would like to dedicate my lecture today both to the students, but also my dear and good friend Avner Di Shalit. I don't know where he is. Avner, can I say this man possesses all the qualities of excellence, of brilliance, of intellectual capacity, of honesty, of being an all-round decent human being, so he could qualify to be an Irishman. So, this is the actual title of my talk. I'm going to present a non-peer-reviewed, rather provocative, the students know what we're in for, analysis of how I think many of the issues in terms of unsustainability. The world is badly ailing. Whether it's the refugee crisis we see, whether it's from Syria, Iraq, Ethiopia, other parts of Africa, whether it's climate change, which is causing so many difficulties, whether it's the unfinished peace or the stalled pieces around the world, even my own country, we still are not completely at peace, that the world is badly ailing and failing in many ways, which is why we need students to go out with head, hand, and hearts able to make this world a better place. And what I'm suggesting is that many of the problems that we face could be interestingly observed, analysed, and maybe solutions found to them by returning to older debates that we had maybe in the 60s and 70s, particularly around ideas of socialism, ideas of community and cooperation, outside either a centralized state or indeed a free market. So I'm going to give you not quite so much a lecture as a series of provocations to get you thinking. This is something that I still find bizarre. We still have to defend the idea of looking after the environment. When I'm teaching and the students didn't get an opportunity to see this, I always begin my course on sustainability by getting them to watch Dr. Seuss and the Lorax, because everything he says there is what I believe in, from the 1960s, or a more up-to-date version of the Lorax. And I do stand before you, I must explain the Marxist lentilism. It works better in English. Essentially, it's a updated version, if you like, of combining what used to be Marxism-Leninism by combining environmentalism and green and red, if you like, socialism and green politics. So I'm going to offer you kind of a big picture analysis. I'm going to be provocative. My teaching style is to melt heads, to stretch minds. And Khalil Gibran is somebody I really enjoy. And as a politician, I'm also a practitioner in a different way in development. I'm not just an academic, I'm also a politician. And I do think there is value in exaggeration. It's when the truth loses its temper, as you'll see. So is green the new red? Karl Marx going around the world to save the planet. Global warming is seen as a dogma by some European leaders. It's seen as a way of smuggling in old socialist or indeed communist ideas. How can we face the menace of tyranny? There's a lot of arguments that you find, particularly on the right, that view climate change and environmental issues as closet ways for a big state and somehow to tyrannize us. Effectively, there's a view that this is what we're facing. Watermelon greens. Green on the outside and red in the middle. That's usually used as a term of abuse. For me, it's a badge of pride. Why can't we look at issues that seem to be discarded by history now in terms of the failure of actually existing socialism, which I would accept? Where does the kibbutzim movement in Israel? It seems to me that there may be elements of this society of recovering some elements that you had in the foundation of your state. But what we have here, I think, in the contemporary era is the choice between continuing on what I would call an ecocidal path of endless accumulation of goods and services, using more and more carbon, promoting a view of the good life, which is essentially whoever dies with the most stuff wins, a sense of the good life tied up in material accumulation, and that this is unsustainable. We haven't got enough planet to enable the 7 billion people, and there'll be 9 billion people by 2050. How can we provide for the decent needs and the flourishing of all the human family as opposed to simply a minority? So my view is that we keep continuing this way, we are going to see exacerbating forms of socioeconomic inequality within and between nations. We'll see more walls being built, more perhaps resource wars over carbon, the remaining carbon fuels on the planet, or we can take a transformative view, start moving away from this carbon-based, consumer-fueled capitalism, which to me is ecologically unsustainable, socio-economically unjust, and after a point does not add to human flourishing in societies or indeed around the world. This to me is the great challenge, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a public health professional, whether you're a development expert, whether you're an economist or political economist. How do we achieve the maximum of human flourishing while living within the ecological parameters of the planet and indeed minimizing our ecological footprint? Because the real issue is, how can we argue for a just transition? It is possible to have a non-democratic, non-just transition to a sustainable economy. But that would mean we would destroy the benefits we've gained in terms of democracy, gender equality perhaps, or indeed in terms of socioeconomic justice. So for me, there's an inextricable link between social and environmental justice. We have to have both right at the heart of any transition from this, what I'm calling carbon-based consumer capitalism, and particularly having the courage to stand up against the orthodoxy of economic growth as somehow automatically good, of GDP increases as somehow the normal state of the economy. And this is something that we all are exposed to day and daily in the news, in our education system, the idea that growth is good, the idea that economic growth in particular is a permanent feature of the economy, which I think is part of the problem that we have. What I'm going to say to you today is based on this book that I wrote a few years ago, and it has to do with my concern about this, the rhetoric that we get at international agreements, and the issue is, how does this translate into practice? Otherwise, you have the danger, as I often say, of the Irish football team. Looks great on paper, less good on grass. And I think this is the problem with a lot of the rhetoric of governments around issues of environmentalism and indeed climate change. And I think to orientate ourselves, and I'm thinking here particularly of my good friend Avner, and in the political theory profession, I think we've made a mistake often in the last number of decades by talking about theories of justice. I mean, that's the most famous post-war political theory text by the great theorist John Rawls. Whereas actually I think we should begin by an analysis of injustice. It is injustice that is the state of the world we live in, just as its unsustainability. And yet most of the field I'm in, and I've been in this field now for over 30 odd years as an activist and an academic, we talk a lot about sustainability, sustainable development, and I often think that we've wasted many decades of research and experimentation and solutions by not looking at the issue of unsustainability, looking at injustice as opposed to ideals of justice. Because it often seems to me that this is what we get stuck in. We've tried to come up with the perfect, the just, the sustainable, rather than the good in the here and now. How can we make things less bad? Now, that might sound like a very modest proposal in terms of reaching some, perfectionist state. But it seems to me that in the pressing needs of the human family, where sadly, in the hour or so that I may talk to you here, 40,000 children in the world will die, needlessly die, because of lack of access to clean water and medicine. This is the awful state of the world that we live in. So let's attend to the injustices and the unsustainability of the contemporary world. I'm going to give you some political theory background. Vicky, this is the quote here from Thomas Simon. Injustice, I argue, should take priority over justice. And if you want a suggestion, perhaps, if you're reviewing the programme and Glocal and so on, find ways of having courses on injustice and unsustainability, in terms of looking at the problems in the world and then trying to find ways of rectifying them. So I think green political theory, my field and economy, should begin from this reality of actually existing unsustainability, and indeed it should take priority. And I do think one of my big concerns is that I think in the university system and in formal education, we are producing technically competent barbarians when it comes to economics. I think economics has a particular place to play in the transition from unsustainability, in part because I think it has most to blame as a form of knowledge which has caused the unsustainability. And by economics, I'm particularly indicating neoclassical economics, if anyone has trained in economics. I think there is more to be said about where does the pluralism and debate in economics that we don't see in the academy. Particularly for me, and this is the subject of my current research, is that the ideological and value basis of dominant forms of economics are never made explicit. Economists like to present themselves as objective, value-free, and neutral. But every form of economics is political. Every form of economics has value statements. Every form of economics is not just making descriptive analysis of how the world is, they are making prescriptive policy proposals about how the world ought to be. So for me, it's about revealing every form of economics, even green, feminist, Marxist, socialist, whatever, Neoclassical economics is equally ideological. But my problem here is that for 3 decades, and I think I speak as somebody who trained as an economist, yet we were never exposed to the different varieties of economic thinking. It was as if the free market approach was the only one on offer. And of course, guess what? If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. So the weaker element of my argument today is not that you should all jettison and not believe neoclassical economics. As I say, neoclassical economics has its place. I think certainly at the microeconomic level, some interesting things it has to say. Less so, I think, at the macroeconomic level. But it's only one form of economics. There are other forms. What about non-Western forms of economic thinking? Indigenous folk ways of understanding the economy, and so on. So the weaker element of my argument is that why is it, those of us who live in democracies, we prize variety, debate and pluralism, but when it comes to economics and the economy, there's silence. All we get is one form of economy. So my argument is for a political economy, a debate around how we're going to organise society, because the key issue in the economy is it stands at the metabolic bridge between humanity and the non-human world. We will not get sustainability until we get a sustainable economy. It is the link between the human species, human societies, and the non-human world and its ecological processes. So these, they're not the enemy, but I certainly think they should be dethroned from the inordinate power economists have in public policy and the way in which we have developed a common sense that this is the only form of economics that matters, and that particularly economic growth is seen as unobjectionably a good thing to have as a permanent feature of the economy. I haven't shocked you enough in terms of challenging economics. We also need to see that the dominant form of economics is a form of capitalist economics. It is supporting the status quo in terms of a capitalist or neoliberal form of economic arrangement. And in particular, it is one that will enable us to continue with this global injustice. I am for free trade, but I'm also for fair trade. We need globalization, certainly, but on terms and conditions that do not impoverish many people around the world, particularly those on less than $1 a day. Provocatively, I think this is a situation that we're in. We need to name what it is we're talking about. And my argument today is that we cannot move to a sustainable society unless we move away from capitalism. Now, that's a debate we haven't had for decades because you're seen as crazy. We thought, oh, we dealt with these ideas and so on. Well, my proposal is that the ecological crisis, the way in which this economic growth model we have is impoverishing many people around the world, it's creating more and more socioeconomic inequality, and indeed, as I'll show, in the Western world, the developed world, the minority world, it's long past the point where it's actually flourishing the communities they live in. It's time to look again at some older ideas in terms of how do we move beyond capitalism. But again, just to recap, we have this dominance of one way of thinking. You know, in some ways you could say it's a tyrannical form of knowledge, because that's the only form of knowledge in terms of the economy. For me, it has captured the economic imagination. It's the only way we can actually think about the economy. And indeed, it offers, I think, a deficient view of the human being. It's a very male view of the human being, of homo economicus, of somebody who is rational, constantly acquisitive, almost like a wee little Pac-Man, that is never content. Or as I said to the students, the model, I think, of homo economicus, for those of you who've seen the film The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, it's Gollum, my precious. And the way in which we've all been encouraged under carbon-based consumer capitalism to accumulate our own goods and services, to reduce and cauterize often our senses of social obligation, and indeed the sharing of the goods and services that we need. And there, I think, in a democracy is a big question. Where is the debate around economics? Where are these clashes of ideas that I think we absolutely we need? And here's just some of the reasons why. I won't go into the boring, more academic details of why we're addicted to economic growth under capitalism. Capitalism has to either grow or die in terms of the development of a capitalist economy. Has to be around 3% a year just to stay stable. So in other words, it's a bit like a bicycle. It either goes and grows or it collapses, which seems to me a particularly ecologically irrational way of an expanding economy when the planet isn't growing, when we're reducing the capacity of the planet to absorb the ultimate pollution, which is heat. That's the main cause of, climate change in terms of greenhouse gases. And I do think there is a major problem, and this here I'm quoting is from some climate change scientists who are looking at the recent Paris Agreement, that there is a contradiction between continuing economic growth and a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gases. There are some very limited examples of decoupling economic growth from carbon intensity, but not sufficient to enable us to continue growing as we have done up until now. And indeed, my view is that economic growth actually requires and reproduces socioeconomic inequality. So if you're a socialist, or you're an egalitarian, or you're somebody who's concerned about making your society less unequal, economic growth may not be the best strategy. In other words, rather than relying on the idea of a growing cake, if the cake isn't growing, demands for a more fair redistribution take precedent. In other words, a growing economy is a way of staving off arguments around redistribution. Whereas my argument is, if you're concerned about the ecological impacts of a growing economy, that it's biophysically impossible to continue indefinitely, that the cake is no longer going to be growing in the way that it was, we have to face square and centre the idea of redistribution. And some of the reasons why capitalism is locked into growth I've mentioned here. But the main point I want to get to is this, is that we have developed an economic system and a form of economics that is ecologically irrational. As I was saying to the students, I think on Sunday, you open up any basic economics textbook, you will find the model of the economy of consumers and producers and wages and goods and services and a nice circulation. You can say, well, where's nature? Where's energy? Where is pollution going? We present an image of the economy that's disembedded rather than being socially embedded in social relations and indeed being embedded in the natural world. Because everything in the human economy that has ever existed, the iPhones, as some of you there are typing saying what a brilliant lecture this is, the glasses, the pens you're using, the electricity that's powering this, are all coming from nature as transformed by human technology and social labour and production. So in other words, the economy, the human economy, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Mother Nature. You cannot have a disembedded economy. It is embedded in the natural world. And I've often wondered, what would an economic system look like that's designed by somebody with some knowledge of thermodynamics and ecological systems, as opposed to somebody who's informed by neoclassical economics? This is particularly for Avner. And I offer two qualifications. I think my analysis is not appropriate to every part of the world. I particularly think in the global south, where the majority of the world's population lives, my argument is not applicable, or it's not applicable in full. So this is aimed squarely at what I would call the overdeveloped minority world of Europe, Australasia, and Japan. And I also am of the view that even in a post-growth economy, we can grow certain parts of it and not grow others. So you can grow one section, say solar panels, infrastructure, but actually decrease maybe pot noodles or some other ecologically irrational form of production. So you can have, as long as the overall macro level of the economy is not growing, you can have differences in growth within the economy. This is Antonio Gramsci, by the way, who obviously tried out for the movie The Matrix but didn't make it. And what I'm proposing is, and this is where the kind of the Marxist, the socialist analysis comes in, is that our modern economic form of thinking is ideological. It is a form, not necessarily of false consciousness, but it certainly has crowded out any other ways of understanding the economy. it has made it more difficult for people even to imagine a life beyond capitalism. I mean, it's this phrase that some of you may have heard, that in our contemporary capitalist societies, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And it seems to me that is a real testament to the strength of this ideology, that there is no alternative. T-I-N-A, in the words of Margaret Thatcher. And for me, and I would certainly use Gramscian analysis. He was an Italian Marxist theorist who did a lot of work on ideology and particularly common sense. And what I'm proposing is that the way economics is spoken about in public discourse in Israel, in Ireland, and other parts of the world, it's mostly a capitalist neoliberal or certainly a neoclassical form of economic discourse that pretends to present itself as objective, value-free, and neutral. My point is that it's not. It has a particular vision of the human being, a particular view of the way society ought to be, but yet it does not admit to its own ideological predispositions. So I would suggest that economic growth, and particularly consumerism, as a mode of understanding our lives and the good life, have become what in Gramscian terms would be called the common sense. Therefore, somebody like me standing up and challenging economic growth and consumerism, I am about as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit. Because what I'm saying is going against the orthodoxy, going against the trend. But it does seem to me, and this is one of the things I've certainly found in my brief encounter with the Glocal students, they are willing to be like salmon, to swim against the tide. Because sometimes we have to stand up and do the right thing. And particularly I have an obligation as an academic, a publicly paid intellectual. This is my analysis. I'm not saying people should believe it, but I have an obligation that those of us who know have an obligation to act in terms of indicating to our communities, our societies, our politicians, our policymakers, hold on, there may be a problem here in terms of this orthodoxy, this common sense view. So if you don't believe me, here's some climate change scientists to back me up. This is Anderson and Bowes in a paper written 2 years ago. You can see what they say there. They basically argue that we cannot meet our climate change commitments as they've been codified now in 2015 in the Paris Agreement, unless they argue temporarily the wealthier countries, the most carbon-intensive countries, reduce their growth strategy, or they call it degrowth, actually contract, partly on the basis of global justice, that in order to enable the majority world to develop, which may include using carbon, which is going to be released into the atmosphere, the minority world has to, a bit like me, as I've been telling students to use my own body as an example, growth is not always good. We have to go on a diet in the developed minority world to enable space, ecological space, carbon space for those in the majority world to develop. So we have to contract our economies to prevent runaway climate change. And as I said to the students in teaching about climate change in this area, and I speak as somebody who is often motivated by the fact that I have children, I have 2 girls, and I now know future generations have names and faces. And I'm reading reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change like this, and it's frightening. You can separate out as an academic, as an intellectual, looking at the trend lines, but then you're a parent, knowing that if your children go on to have grandchildren, you'll be a grandparent, and you're looking at the world that's coming into being in 2050, 2060. And it can be very frightening. As I was saying to the students, often I tell people, when you're reading these reports on climate change and unsustainability, you need 3 things. One is a good bottle of Irish whiskey. Abner has some, and Edo has some. Good Bushmills whiskey from Ireland. The second one is a holy book of your choice. And the third one, if both of those fail, is a razor blade. Because I kid you not, reading this material, I think, should come with a major health warning, because it can be very morally disturbing and indeed existentially troubling to imagine if we keep developing as a species, keep continuing pumping up carbon, greenhouse gases, the accumulation of more and more stuff, the accumulation of more and more wastes, we will create an apocalyptic vision of the future. And the problem, of course, is it's very hard to motivate people around an apocalyptic vision. But I would just say, just in passing, that the apocalypse from the Greek term means a lifting of the veil. And it seems to me that in crises, in an apocalyptic vision, there may be opportunities to see things differently. But it is quite frightening when you look at the way in which business as usual, which every government in the world wants to continue. I would say most people around the world are still of the view that growth is good. They have a vision of the future, that it's going to be like today, but with better apps. It's going to be like today, but more. We have this sense of projecting this short period of high consumer affluence forward into the future. And to me, this is particularly interesting as an Irishman, but much like Israelis and other people from this part of the world, we are very historically attuned. Even the briefest, most cursory understanding of history, of human history, will show us that civilizations have risen and fallen, often for ecological war. They've overextended themselves. So why on earth in our arrogance do we think our carbon-based consumer form of capitalism is going to continue into the future? In terms, it seems to be a particularly ahistorical, if not ecologically irrational position to take. And this is my view. The system isn't broke. Capitalism isn't broke. It doesn't need fixing. It was made that way. It's got a systemic failure in that it's ecologically irrational, socially unjust or blind to social injustice. And really, in its undifferentiated view, it doesn't care how the economic wealth is divided. All it cares about is the single figure of GDP and capital accumulation. So what we need is system change, not climate change. And I do think this brings me to older arguments with Marxism, socialism, communism even, of going back and seeing what is the appropriate mix. And I do think the three institutions we have in human society to organize our productive life and our social life, the oldest of these is the community. That predates both the state and the free market. The state is only a couple of 100 years old. The free market similarly. So my view is, what is the mix of the state, the market and community in terms of creating a sustainable political economy and society? And I do think there is a moment now where what I'm calling here the social economy, the informal economy, the bit that's never included in our GDP, of the sweat equity, the volunteering efforts, the non-monetary exchange, the unpaid work of women around the world, that capitalism is parasitic on. All of this is the time now for this model of the economy and economic organization to come to the fore. But there's also a role for the state. You know, whether you read Marx or whether you read Karl Polanyi, the idea in part is the state protects us from the amoral, and in this case, ecological irrationality of the market. The market has no stop sign. It's almost like a child that is voracious. It has no built-in off mechanism. As I say, that it grows or dies. It's like a bicycle that goes and grows or collapses. The state, if you like, is an institution that can protect society from the worst deprivations of a free market economy. And for me, I think something like a green welfare state is part of this green-red ideology or approach to understanding sustainability, and particularly reclaiming the language of innovation and entrepreneurship. Nothing annoys me more when I see my fellow academics or in the media, people viewing innovation purely in technology terms, in patentable, commercially exploitable forms of technological innovation. Yes, we should have that. But what about social innovation? What about new ways of organizing our collective life? What about rewarding social entrepreneurship in the same way as rewarding commercial entrepreneurship? So I think part of this is about having more experimentation, about including the ideas of innovation beyond simply technological innovation. And let's leave this as a question, because the market, again, we've had markets for hundreds of thousands of years, or at least thousands of years, sorry. So the idea that can we have a post-capitalist but pro-market, where markets can still exist. And I'll just finish by giving you an example from my current research of this red-green synergy, or maybe why an eco-socialism is a way of understanding this transition to a more sustainable development form. I wouldn't expect you to read it all. This is Mazzucato, and I'm looking at the low-carbon energy transition. Her argument is that what we need is patient capital. Because of the long lead-in times with infrastructure in energy, we cannot wait for the market to do that because they demand returns often every quarter. The state can be patient capital in terms of laying down the foundations for a low-carbon transition. And also, we have to recognize, and indeed you're not innocent of this in Israel, given the Supreme Court judgment, I think, on Monday, that the transition in energy is not some sort of technical switch, that one day we switch from carbon to nuclear or to low-carbon renewable energy. It's a political struggle. And one example of this is from Frank Giels, who's a Dutch expert in socio-technical transitions, is that fossil fuel interests and companies will not simply give up the power that they have. They have the power of incumbency. But it's also the power of familiarity, where most people are used to coal, oil and gas. But for me, this is about seeing that the energy transition is not a technical issue, it is actually a political, and particularly the idea of social struggle in terms of how we make this transition. And part of this struggle for me is about how, on the one hand, do we delegitimize fossil fuels? We have to say that fossil fuels have now passed the point where they are a net benefit to society. They are now causing more harm than good, particularly if we don't just focus on the greenhouse gas emissions of carbon, for example. But if you look at the Ogoni people in Nigeria, you look at the way in which the coal mines of China are impacting on the workers there. If you factor in other words, from the source of extraction to burning, every step of that way, we have now passed the point where coal, oil and gas are actually net benefits to society. And I do think that it's also contributing to geopolitical instability. Wars for oil, wars for the remaining petrochemical resources around the world. And I do think we have to move beyond unlocking the energy system from fossil fuels. Now, at the same time, a bit like the way we try to delegitimize cigarettes or excessive cigarette smoke, and there's kind of a similar battle going on where you got so-called scientific experts trying to sow doubt that cigarettes don't cause cancer, burning carbon doesn't cause climate change. It's a very similar pattern in terms of the seeds of doubt being sown, particularly by the fossil fuel industries who are affected by this. But at the same time as delegitimizing fossil fuels and avoiding wars for oil, that's an inconvenient truth. That the war and occupation in Iraq, according to Alan Greenspan, not me, former chief of the Fed in America, was a war for oil. We are addicted to oil. Name me one thing in this room, one thing, that isn't made in whole or part, or transported in whole or part, without the use of oil. Somebody say? If you could come up with something at the end. I've been doing this for years, this similar kind of talk, and the only thing that somebody ever said to me was a fly. A fly flew into the room. But I throw it out as a challenge to you. I'm just trying to indicate how everything from the food in your tummies, the contact lenses in my eyes, the power we're getting for this, the microphone, the cups that hold the water under here, all made in whole or part, or transported in whole or part by the use of fossil fuels and particularly oil. That's the engineering challenge. That's the public health challenge. That's the global challenge in terms of how do we begin to move away from this form of energy. Now, here's one way. Whoever thought bicycling could be a revolutionary act? But at the same time as delegitimizing fossil fuels, we also have to recognize and reframe that actually fossil fuels probably are too valuable a chemical resource to burn. This is just a list of all the things you can make out of oil in particular. So maybe it's about reframing carbon as something not to be used as a fuel. So start calling it fossil resource, because a fuel is something you burn. Whereas a resource, yeah, you can burn it, but it has other uses as well. So as well as delegitimizing carbon and saying thank you very much, you've been a wonderful energy-dense, portable form of energy, without which many great things could not be achieved by human society, the time now is to say goodbye. And in the words of Fatih Birol, who's the chief economist of the International Energy Association, we need to leave oil before oil leaves us. We need to leave oil before oil leaves us. It's simply too useful to burn. And some economists now have begun to calculate the opportunity cost by us continuing to burn oil and not make all these things and others. There's thousands of products that can be made from oil. If you calculate all those lost products that we can make from not burning fossil fuels, it comes out at quite an eye-watering between about $9 billion a year, quite a sizable proportion of global GDP. This is from Matthias Kroll. But I do think, in terms of this energy transition, we have to have this idea that there should be no low-carbon transition and no decarbonisation without participation and democratisation. I know this is one of the parts of the values of the Glocal programme. So this is the idea of this just transition. Do you want, effectively, large corporations developing the Negev desert with solar panels to provide you with low-carbon renewable energy? Or do you want to try and find a way of using that technology to empower households, to empower communities? That's what I mean by no decarbonisation without participation and democratisation. Otherwise, you're simply greening business as usual. You're continuing the centralised corporate control of energy, but simply now it's green rather than fossil fuel. And the importance here of people having ownership, and that old idea, means of production. Ownership of the means of production here in terms of energy. But also there is a role here for the state in terms of planning, which often gets a bad name because of what happened in the Soviet Union. But the argument here is that if we're facing such challenges ahead, we have to plan for them, and particularly in terms of infrastructure, which I think is the coming issue that we have to face. So, to finish, I think there is an argument to be made that we are now coming to the end of the way of life that we know it under consumer carbon-based capitalism. We can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, in part by using some of the analysis, and of course others that have developed this idea of a green-red synthesis. And I'll leave you with this thought, as I left the students with during this week. The end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world. It's just the end of the world as we know it. So, thank you.